Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, San Diego's mayor goes on camera to urge the Republican Party to start supporting same-sex marriage. And cyclist Floyd Landis makes an expensive deal to avoid a trial for wire fraud.
Plus, we'll take an in-depth look at the grim milestone announced this week on America's war in Afghanistan and why nearly half of the 2,000 troops killed in that war died in the last 2 years, including many Marines from Camp Pendleton.
And when those wildfires were burning, fire officials sent in the Marines and the Navy, too. We'll have a look at the rare joint effort. KPBS Evening Edition starts now.
KPBS Evening Edition is made possible by Joan and Erwin Jacobs and by
Hello, good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dwayne Brown. San Diego Mayor Jerry Sanders is urging the Republican Party to support same-sex marriage. He's made a commercial set to air in Tampa during next week's Republican National Convention. In it, he refers to his change of heart about same-sex marriage 5 years ago.
This issue, thanks to leaders like Dick and Lynn Cheney, Laura Bush, Ted Olson, and Cindy McCain. Marriage strengthens families, and we need more of that in this country, not less. Please join us.
Marriage Equality Group sponsored the ad. Next week, GOP delegates are expected to confirm the party's support for a constitutional amendment defining marriage as the union of a man and a woman. In the race to replace Mayor Sanders, a new poll out tonight gives a 6-point lead to Congressman Bob Filner. The poll comes from our media partner, 10 News. 47% of those surveyed said they preferred Filner, while 41% support Councilman Carl DeMaio. 12% were undecided. It's a 2-point drop for DeMaio since the last survey. Filner has gained 1 point, but the number of undecided voters also went up 1 point. Mayor Sanders met with his counterparts from 25 border cities today. Border crossing, immigration, and public safety were on the agenda. Sanders says the border region can no longer wait on Washington to make decisions. He says mayors need to make their own improvements.
Can we have a much better chance of impacting and influencing the way the money is going to be spent throughout the border region?
Tijuana's mayor says whoever replaces Sanders in San Diego will have a tough act to follow.
The example that Mayor Sanders has left, it's brought the very high expectation.
Mayor Bustamante says his relationship with Sanders is a model for other border cities. Cyclist Floyd Landis has 3 years to repay nearly $500,000 to people who donated to his defense fund. Landis made a deal in federal court in San Diego today, admitting he lied to donors when he claimed he didn't use performance-enhancing drugs. He was stripped of his Tour de France title for doping. If he doesn't pay back the money, he could be tried for wire fraud and face a possible 20-year prison sentence. Landis's deal comes on the same day the U.S. anti-doping agency stripped Lance Armstrong of his 7 Tour de France titles. Landis had accused Armstrong of doping. There will be more on the Armstrong case on the PBS NewsHour right after Evening Edition. For the first time in 5 years, the state agency CAL FIRE got assistance from the military to put out a series of wildfires in San Diego's rural backcountry last week. The Vallecito fires in the East County posed enough of a threat to people and property to call in the Marines and Navy. By the time the lightning-sparked fires near Julian were contained last weekend, more than 23,000 acres were burned. But few structures were damaged, and no one was severely hurt. 8 Marine Corps helicopters and 3 Navy choppers pitched in for the first time since the devastating 2007 wildfires in San Diego's backcountry.
We train continuously year after year for an event like this, so it was very fulfilling to see the plan that we put forth come together in a safe and effective manner to serve the public. In the 60s and 70s, this airplane was doing forward air control over Vietnam.
Ray Cheney is a battalion chief with CAL FIRE. He says the biggest challenge working with the military was integrating resources effectively.
So how can we safely take a Navy aircraft or a Marine Corps aircraft and put them into an environment that they've never worked in before, working alongside with civilian aircraft in a very delicately balanced and congested airspace over a fire.
He says they were able to meet the challenge because they trained with the military every year for such an event.
And so when we did activate them, it was a seamless transition for them to come into the recent incidents.
CAL FIRE actually has the largest aerial firefighting fleet in the world and can respond to a 911 call within 15 minutes anywhere in California.
That's my office right there in the back of that plane.
Cheney grew up in San Diego and has always enjoyed flying, and he proudly showed off his office where he commands the firefight from the air.
This is the OV-10 Bronco, so this is a fantastic airplane for what we do. It's got excellent visibility, it's got a great radio package, and it's very, very fast.
So how fast, you say? It can fly about 320 miles an hour, and CAL FIRE has the largest fleet of these planes. With the Santa Ana season still to come, Cheney recommends we all go over our emergency plans for what to do in case of a fire. For suggestions, go to the website readysandiego.org. This week, the U.S. reached a grim milestone in the war in Afghanistan. 2,000 troops killed in the last 2 years. Tonight, Peggy Pico explores why so many were from Camp Pendleton.
It took 9 years for the grim toll of American military deaths in the war in Afghanistan to reach 1,000, but that number doubled in just the last 27 months. Here to explain some possible reasons for the jump is Tony Perry, San Diego bureau chief of the Los Angeles Times. Tony, thanks for being here. America invaded Afghanistan just shortly after 9/11 in the fall of 2001. How have the dynamics since then changed in that war, especially in the last 2 years?
Well, in late 2009, of course, the president authorized a surge of troops into places America really hadn't been before, or hadn't been in large numbers. Helmand province in the south and west, Kandahar nearby, and then also way over on the eastern, the mountainous areas. And when you send troops in, and with the order to locate, close, engage, and kill the enemy, you're going to have casualties on both sides, and that's what we've seen.
Well, the Army has more troops on the ground in Afghanistan and more overall fatalities. However, the Marines were dying at twice the rate as the Army soldiers starting back in 2010. Is it because of where they were going, as you were saying?
Well, it's the same as Iraq, much of the same metrics. The Marines were a smaller number, but their casualties were disproportionate, if you will. And for a long period of time, Camp Pendleton had the dubious distinction of having more killed than any military base in America, in Iraq. Same is true in Afghanistan. The Marines went to Helmand province, a Taliban stronghold, and they located, closed, engaged, and fought with the Taliban. One particular battalion, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, they had 25 dead over a period of about 6 months, and 180 wounded, many of them grievously, double amputees, that kind of thing. When you engage the enemy, you're going to have casualties. The president said engage, and they did.
The Camp Pendleton Marines that you were just talking about from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Regiment, where were they in 2010? Do you know?
I know exactly. I spent time with them. They were in a nasty place called Sangin. Sangin was a hotspot, if you will, for Taliban. They ran it. It's where the farmers grow the poppies that turn into heroin, the profits of which fund the insurgency. They also fund a rather complex narcotics network. Marines went in there to push them out of Sangin, and they did, at a great grievous price. And then, of course, the issue is, will the Afghan government move in and win the loyalty of the people on the ground? We're still seeing that process.
The Pentagon says many of the recent attacks were either by spies from Pakistan, the Taliban, or other things like that. Does that matter who they're from, really?
Well, it doesn't matter, certainly, to those American victims. You're right, we've had 40 Americans killed in the so-called insider killings. That's when an Afghan soldier, policeman, or someone wearing the uniform, or someone who has authority to be at an American base turns on their American allies. All sorts of reasons why. Nobody knows exactly why. Even the head general, John Allen, said the other day maybe a quarter of the cases were inspired by the Taliban, that they sent somebody in, or maybe they coerced them to turn on the Americans.
It's been 11 years. We still have 80,000 troops in Afghanistan right now. So why don't we hear much about it during the presidential campaign?
Well, there's a 5-letter word that tells you why, and that word is draft. There is no military draft. And with no military draft, it isn't much of a political issue. The polls have shown, gosh, for the last 24, 36 months, 2/3 of the American public wish we were out. Yes, but they're not doing anything about it. And so without a political push, the policy stands as it is. And Mitt Romney and the incumbent, Barack Obama, they're not all that far apart on Afghanistan. They both believe we need to be there. We need to have our combat troops there until at least the end of 2014. So without a dispute at that level, it's hard for it to filter down. But the bottom line is there's no military draft as there was in Vietnam.
When are Americans, I think that the date has changed, American troops supposed to be out completely?
Dates, as they say, keep sliding to the right. The talk now is all combat troops out by 2014. But there's a bit of slippage to that. Special Forces, Marine Special Forces, Green Berets, that kind of thing, probably going to be there longer. The CIA, probably going to be there longer. We'll probably be launching those drones for attacks both in Pakistan and Afghanistan for a period of time. We're there for a period of time if we believe we have to influence events there for our own safety. That's a political issue. If we think we need to do that, it's not going to be done quick. It's going to take a long time. Now the question is, will the Afghans be ready when we leave to take over the heavy lifting of fighting the Taliban? We'll see.
Yeah, nobody can predict that. Tony Perry, San Diego Bureau Chief with the Los Angeles Times. Thanks for talking with us today.
My pleasure.
We told you earlier this week, San Diego's economy could take a hit of nearly $6 billion if Congress doesn't reach an agreement on taxes and spending cuts. A large part of the hit will come from cuts to defense spending. KPBS reporter Allison St. John recently looked at how those cuts could impact the military and defense contractors.
Looking out from the Cabrillo Monument over San Diego's magnificent bay, you can see why it's such a desirable spot for the Navy. About 60 ships are or will soon be home ported here. Admiral James Johnson says studies suggest about a quarter of the region's wages come from federal defense spending.
We've got a little over 100,000 active duty men and women in uniform, roughly evenly split between the Navy and the Marine Corps, plus an additional 25,000 or so civilian jobs that these are directly to DoD. Then when you add in the vendors, the suppliers, contractors, people like that, that's another source of jobs. So altogether it adds up to about 350,000.
Even though the military is being asked to absorb more than $400 billion in cuts over the next decade, San Diego could see gains.
If you look at what the guidance says we're going to focus on, Asia Pacific, that favors San Diego. You can't execute that strategy without using a lot of the assets that are in the San Diego region.
Under the military budget cuts proposed this spring, San Diego should do better than other communities with big military installations because the U.S. strategy is shifting resources to the West Coast. But if sequestration happens next spring, San Diego could be hurt more than other communities because its economy is so dependent on the military.
We think sequestration is going to happen.
Frank Hewitt of the National Defense Industry Association in San Diego says sequestration is a hammer waiting to fall. It's been triggered by Congress's inability to reach consensus on how to reduce the federal deficit. It could mean a 10% across-the-board cut, adding up to $500 billion in additional cuts to defense spending over the next 10 years, starting in January.
There are a lot of companies that are cutting that indirect workforce that's not working direct labor in order to get themselves in a position to weather that storm. So I would expect layoffs in larger numbers from some of the larger companies.
Hewitt says small companies could be even more hard hit by sequestration than big companies like SAIC or Cubic.
DoD has to say, well, we're going to close this production line down in order to protect this one over here. Those impacts could be felt then by the supporting small business contractors that are subcontractors to those prime contractors that are doing those major programs, shipbuilding and things like that.
Former San Diego Congressman Republican Duncan Hunter recently gathered a group of retired military to launch a super PAC, Fight for America. It's raising money to air ads opposing defense cuts in the budget and sequestration.
When America is strong, our future is secure. But Barack Obama is taking the wind out of our military. Now is not the time to cut defense spending, Mr. President. Not now.
But San Diego Democratic Congresswoman Susan Davis says it's not the president who's responsible for Congress's failure to reach consensus, and that's what's triggering sequestration.
What worries me, of course, whenever you have scary tactics that people choose to employ because they can fund it with dollars that are not traceable, that we're not hearing, the full side of this. These super PACs can say and do anything that they want. Nobody is accountable. And so, yes, they can say that this is all on the president. They can say that this is an effort only by one party rather than another. We know that that's not true.
Davis, who is on the Armed Services Committee, says she's going to fight to make sure service members' pay and benefits aren't cut. But she says there are other ways to cut military spending without compromising national security.
We see that many of our colleagues want to say, well, we don't want to touch defense. Well, I don't want to touch defense either. But in order to not touch defense, everything else needs to go.
Davis says the United States needs to keep funding other things like education, transportation, and energy in order to remain strong. A man who's very familiar with the ebbs and flows of federal funding is Greg Knoll of San Diego's Legal Aid Society.
The budget often gets balanced on the backs of poor, elderly, disabled, and the middle class. Do we want to provide health care to people? Do we want to care for the elderly and disabled and the children on the streets? Do we care about that group?
Knoll says he's seeing more and more people becoming disenfranchised.
They don't have what is most important, mother's milk of politics, which is money. So they'll never have a super PAC.
The budget Congress is debating right now includes cuts to things like food stamps, school lunch programs, and housing assistance. While the defense budget could hurt other regions, it does include a small pay raise for military personnel and almost $300 million in military construction projects for San Diego.
Here in San Diego, that we need to fight hard for those areas where we feel we could not afford to cut. And there are some, and then yet there are other areas where we probably could look at and say, okay, this is not as important as something else.
KPBS reporter Allison St. John. Sequestration is certain to be a topic at the Republican National Convention next week. We will bring you PBS convention coverage every night starting at 5. Evening edition will not be seen Monday through Thursday next week because of this special coverage. Prosecutors say shooting suspect James Holmes told a classmate he wanted to kill people back in March. Holmes grew up in San Diego. He's accused of killing 12 people and wounding 58 others at a movie theater outside Denver last month. Prosecutors say Holmes also threatened a professor. They say he was angry because he was failing school. Defense attorneys say Holmes is mentally ill. 2 San Diego killings made headlines once again this week, one with a dramatic courtroom outburst from the accused, and the other involved an 11-year-old boy. Peggy Pico takes a closer look.
A boy who was just 10 years old when he stabbed his playmate to death in East County was ruled to be mentally incompetent and will not stand trial. Meanwhile, Armando Perez, accused of killing his estranged wife, 19-year-old Diana Gonzalez, in October 2010, surprised the judge at his arraignment on Wednesday with this.
I want to know what I'm guilty, all right? I'm guilty. They're telling me not to be guilty.
J.W. August of 10 News joins me with details on these 2 tragic murders and the impact they may have on future cases in the county. J.W., thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Give us a little background on sort of the backstory on the Diana Gonzalez situation. What led up to her murder?
Well, the husband was stalking her. Earlier than that, he had raped her, allegedly raped her, assaulted her. She went to try to get a restraining order or even something stronger to take care of him because she was worried about him. And the district attorney decided there wasn't enough there to do anything with him, and he murdered her in that in the City College bathroom.
There was quite a public outcry, especially against the DA's office and Bonnie DeMantis. Why did the DA not press charges or not hold Perez accountable?
That's a $64,000 question. And so far, we really haven't had the straight poop on that. The only thing they've said about this case is, well, we've really toughened things up since then, and we're going to do a much better job. But what about this young lady's death? Why did the district attorney decide not to at least arrest him? It requires two levels. The district attorney looks at cases, can I take this guy to trial and the jury find him guilty? Or is this guy dangerous enough that I will just lock him up until I figure this stuff out? They had that option, and they chose not to do that option.
Yeah, and Bonnie DeMantis, if I recall, said at the time, in response to public criticism, said, we didn't have enough evidence. Right. What kind of evidence?
Right, exactly. But did not have enough probable cause with this guy's history and the relationship with his wife and her physical, what happened to her neck and all the things that came out over time. What do you need? You have to have a conviction, a sure conviction, to lock a nut up like that ahead of time.
How did Bonnie DeMantis respond to the court outburst that we just saw?
I don't know how she responded, but I know the judge, silencing the court, and that surprised everybody. And, the cousin yelled something at the defendant, the accused, too, in the court. And whether he said he was guilty, not guilty, doesn't matter on that particular part of the process. He could have taken out pictures and, put the gun on the table, but doesn't matter. Whatever he said there didn't really matter. It was just very much out of character for a case.
You're mentioning that because the attorney, Perez's attorney, still entered a guilty plea even after publicly he said, I did it, I'm guilty.
Right. Well, no, I mean, not guilty plea.
Right. The attorney entered a not guilty plea, even though Perez said, "I'm guilty." How
They
come?
need to work that out a little later. Perhaps it's a public defender, and they haven't talked a lot, whatever the reason. But it doesn't matter what he said at that particular hearing. What Perez said at that hearing, it didn't matter. That's to be determined in the next hearing.
Very briefly, the 11-year-old boy in East County, he was found incompetent to stand trial. Is it because of his age?
Yes, he was competent enough. He was mental. He had enough mental capacity to figure out how a knife would kill somebody. He knew that. That wasn't the issue. The issue is, did he understand the consequences of his action? And it was decided he didn't. He didn't understand what being dead is.
We're not identifying the boy because of his age, but what happens to him now?
There's one more hearing, a procedure they go to, and he'll probably be under the control of the court. They'll put him in a place where he doesn't have a lot of freedom, hopefully exposed to rehab. His whole story is sad. His mother was on drugs and boozing it up when gave birth to him. The poor kid didn't have a chance from the get-go. It's just a sad story. You hate to hear that. I mean, and the poor boy that passed away and his parents, it's sad.
All right, and we have very little time left, but very quickly, do these kind of cases impact San Diego, in your opinion?
The criminal justice system is not perfect, and we're always going to have cases like this. I don't think long-term it's going to impact them. We're going to see stories and cases like this come down the road again and again. It's sad, people, emotions. We all have a little darkness inside of us, and it's always going to happen.
All righty, J.W. August, thank you so much for talking with me.
Community college students headed back to school this week, but getting the courses they need has been a challenge because of rising enrollments and shrinking budgets. Reporter Mona Lisa Noor has the story.
About 28,000 students started school this week at Palomar Community College in San Marcos, but because some classes fill up so quickly, many students are left with the last resort option of what's known as crashing, or showing up on the first day in hopes of getting in.
I was crashing 3 classes this semester, and I was only able to get into 1.
Mohassa El Najjar is a 6th-year student at Palomar College.
It's very frustrating, and I mean, I would be able to take more classes and I'd be able to complete my classes quicker if I was able to get into the classes I'm trying to get into.
It's a sentiment shared by many students, says Angel Jimenez, Vice President of the Associated Student Government at Palomar College.
A lot of students are not being able to find the classes, especially the core classes that they need because of the budget cuts.
And more budget cuts are on the horizon. But Governor Jerry Brown's Proposition 30 seeks to fund public education by increasing the state's sales tax by 1/4 cent and increase personal income taxes for high-income earners. It's an initiative that Palomar President Robert Deegan says is imperative. Without it, Deegan says Palomar will lose $6 million, or 7% from this year's budget.
In the event that the initiative doesn't pass, and what that would mean, it's dramatic cuts to the number of class sections in the spring, and a reduction in services that we're able to provide our students.
Deegan says if Proposition 30 does not pass, as many as 445 class sections could be cut from the spring term, leaving Palomar College unable to serve approximately 2,600 students. The cuts, Deegan says, could also cause a ripple effect, stifling student transfers to UC and Cal State schools.
Mona Lisa Noor reporting California State University students go back to school on Monday. Tonight's stories are on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. A reminder, next week we will bring you PBS coverage of the Republican National Convention Monday through Thursday. We will be back with Evening Edition next Friday. Have a good night and a great weekend.